This is us. So
My messy house.
I'm happy to introduce Dr. Cedillo. Dr. Cedillo is an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric from the University of Houston Clear Lake. And then I'm going to allow her to talk about specifically what are her research focuses.
Well, thanks everybody for being here on a Friday afternoon, though I know it's earlier over there than here, but still. Thank you so much for having me. My research interests are primarily embodied rhetorics of embodiment. What I do with this is I look at intersections of race, gender, and disability, and basically look at how all of that is interwoven in creating oppressions and what I call rhetorics of embodiment that are either oppressive or privileging to certain groups. So a lot of the times you can probably think about rhetorics of embodiment as not discourses about the bodies per se, but what they're doing when they work together. So when Ian Bagos talks about, say, things like video games, right, that there's procedural rhetorics, it's that these things get you to do things. That's what I mean by a rhetoric. A rhetoric meaning a guide, so to speak, of how you should be acting, how you should behave, how you should look, etc., and how you should inhabit your body in order to be seen as human. And I look at that transhistorically because I started off as a medieval rhetorics person with the understanding that I always wanted to look at how these things find expression nowadays. There's some hidden histories there that people are finally starting to look at that show that this notion of the past is kind of an illusion, right? So one of the things that I'm really interested in is the ways, somebody said I should never say the ways in which. That's like the current Twitter computers and writing thing. But for example, one of the things that I'm really interested in is that during the Middle Ages, a lot of the rhetorics of or discourses of corporeality targeting Jewish people and facilitating their ghettoization and things like the Inquisition were later procedurized and used in the Americas during the colonization in other locations as well. So uncovering those histories to see what we can find and ways, looking for ways to counter those effects in everyday life, especially outside the academy, because I really think that one of the other branches of my research is how to make academic research more accessible and actually get us to start listening to the people who live these things. And I think it's really important, especially as more of us who understand what it's like to live under coloniality and things like that are able to start finding room and making room for more of us in the academy. So I also look at things like critical pedagogy, digital stuff, especially the ways in which people try to say that the internet is a neutral space as opposed to like a still violently racist and colonial space too, right? Because we never leave those things behind. So that's kind of it. And so now also some of my research is also on how to promote ethical publishing practices and how to make things more inclusive of non-academic voices within the academy so that we're talking with people rather than over them. So that's the long thing.
Awesome. So right now I'll start off with one of my questions that I had prepared, and then from there we'll turn to questions from the other tutors.
Okay.
And so one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, one of the ideas that you bring up throughout, I think just about all your work, is the idea that just by being and occupying in a space, it takes energy. And taking up that space, we are by coming from marginalized positions, we are in fact disrupting those spaces. And that made me start to think about in terms of whose role is it to who is actively disrupting those spaces? Is it constantly falling to the is that job constantly falling to those who already carry with them marginalized identities and histories to do that disruption, instead of those with privileged positionings? And then what are your thoughts in terms of that labor and the way that it should or is currently divided? Yeah.
Okay, that's a really good question, and it's something, for example, that right now we're in the midst of dealing with a situation where a particular journal editor has published some very, very violent transphobic information and promulgated it as science. And I find that, you know, for me, I think it's very important that we step up for different people who may not supposedly be part of a community, but we're united in the fact that we know what it's like to live with certain oppressions. And sometimes we have the energy and sometimes we're really tired. But I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up, right, is that who gets to lead the conversation on what needs to happen and what disruption is. And so one of the things that I like to talk to my students a lot about, and it kind of helps us understand, right, because a lot of the times when we talk about race, people get really prickly or they get really you know, it's a sensitive subject, but it's only a sensitive subject because we've made it one. Because, you know, it falls to those of us, you know, especially people of color, to always talk about racism. And when we don't, people are like, well, why aren't you? But then when we do, people are like, why are you always talking about race? And it's like, well, why don't you ask me why I always have to live with it? Maybe how about something like that, right? So one of the things that I always talk to my students about is intersectional identities, right? And the way that, you know, Indigenous scholar Sandy Grande talks about whiteness, the white stream, right? That white privilege cannot exist without class privilege, ability privilege, you know, it's very cis, it's very masculine, right? It's a very colonial construct. And the way that I see it as a phenomenologist is that whiteness is the ability to live without marker, right? Like you're already assumed, right? So I always tell my students, you know, if you're going to use a racial marker for that person, oh, you know, that Mexican person or this, but like sometimes people won't use that for a white person. So the personhood is already intrinsic, right? So we can think about whiteness as a phenomenon that is the absence of disruption, right? Because it just kind of is. Hence why I think when you see a lot of white allies talking about these things, they can be credited because it's coming out of nowhere, right? Versus, you know, people of color, people who are marginalized, you know, trans people, and so on, people who have to basically bear those additional markers that are always already letting privileged people or reminding privileged people that we exist and that, you know, that lack of disruption in a planar field is an illusion, right, and a violent one. We're already always doing that work just by existing. And so this is where it starts to get kind of complicated, because here's the thing. I think it's really important that because so many of us are already having to do twice as much work for half the credit, as you know that saying says, I think it is important that we get credit for that. I think it's very important. You know, the reason I wrote that recent article is because I think a lot of people never stop to think about all the things I was having to deal with going through graduate school and being made to, you know, striving against this idea that I just didn't fit, that I wasn't good enough. Even though I thought to myself, hey, you're the one who gave me the money to be here. Maybe it's you. Maybe you don't know what you want, right? So those of us who have to do that labor, like, we need to be listened to. We need the spaces to talk to each other. we shouldn't have to always be directing our scholarship and our dialogue towards the people who don't know what it's like. Sometimes we do need those. I don't want to call them safe spaces because, you know, when we're in group, you know, things can still get heated, but we need those in-group spaces to figure out where we want to move together, right, as a community. So on the one hand, that's one issue, right? Like making sure that we center the voices of the people who are living that experience, but also understanding that sometimes it's not feasible because those people could be a target. And I know that if I have the privilege, then I can not take the reins, but take the heat. And there's a big difference, right? And I think that's something that we, as, you know, as a field, or maybe as in the academy in general, like we never stop to disentangle those things and what that means. So I think the main thing, especially, is to realize, you know, like people are really suspect of the word ally, but ally is not a person, it's a process, right? And you have to step up, and sometimes that's going to be like somebody tells you, hey, like you don't get it, like that's not how it is. And I have to just kind of be like, you know what, you're right. Does it mean that my feelings are hurt sometimes? Yeah, you know, I'm a person, but I have to understand that my feelings, you know, I'll get over it in like an hour. Although I have anxiety, so maybe it might be a few days. But it's not the same thing as having to constantly live it, right? Our bodies are molded by the spaces we inhabit, and if we're constantly butting up against like the margins of spaces where we don't belong, it's almost like we become all elbows, right? Like all like kind of awkward. So we're always going to be disruptive, I think. So I think, yeah, I think that's like the really big conversation. But I think first and foremost, we could just ask. I think a lot of the times we do things without asking, right? Like we take it for granted that we need to save people. Don't worry, I'll help you. And it's like, no, I don't need help, right? I need you to just kind of make room by stepping aside, right? I think too often, if you do it too much, you know, trying so hard to be an ally, it ends up really feeling empty, like virtue signaling sometimes, where it's like, oh, good for you. Like, yes, we all see you, you're trying to help out. There's a big difference between that and understanding that allyship, right, especially from an Indigenous perspective, is going to be about relationship. And relationships are not built overnight, okay? And by Indigenous, I don't just mean like Native Americans, but, you know, folks from all over the world, you know, Africans, African Americans. I mean, we are people that were colonized, right? And relationships, especially familial relationships and the families that we can make, have helped us to survive for the last 500 years. But I think it's a process that people who've never had to live under that circumstance have never had to understand, right? It's very like, oh, I'm going to talk to you. And it's like, no, there's a give and take, right? And so I think, I mean, I'm not going to offer a solution, right? We haven't figured it out yet. But I do think that there are things that we can do. And I think understanding where we are in terms of positionality is crucial. I think it's something that we need to start teaching students from the very beginning. I don't take it easy with my first year comp students. We talk about positionality, we talk about phenomena, we talk about, you know, intersections, all of that stuff. I mean, explained correctly, I think people can really grasp it because we all live it. And the sooner that we can start talking about that, the sooner people understand, like, okay, this is how I can approach people in my writing. And in everyday life, which is what matters. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, yeah, definitely. Thank you. Now it's Jolina. Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about You talked
Hi.
about things. Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Jolina.
Hi.
You talked about a couple of things, but I want to circle back around to the use of intersectionality as an analytical tool. And I was thinking about that. All tools have to have some kind of calibration. And if we're using intersectionality as a tool, how do we, in our work, as inclusive as it is dynamic? I don't know.
So what I do, well, I think that there's the two things, right? So at my school, you know, there are certain things we have to teach, but other than that, it's on us. So apparently I'm the one who gets to be the radical teacher, you know, who says writing doesn't happen as an outline, and people are like grumpy, but whatevs. But, you know, especially if you've got to, you know, calibrate and people need to be looking at the same ways, the same frameworks, there are some interesting ways to do it, right? So one of the exercises that I tend to do with my students is that, you know, we draw like literal intersections, and we talk about all of the different identities that a person may have, right? And then we talk about the fact that just because some of them might not be a marker that is used for you doesn't mean that it's not part of your identity. So for example, if we're going to talk about undocumented people, you don't get to talk about yourself as just being. You are documented, right? And with it comes certain privileges and responsibilities. But we also talk about all the other different intersections, like language use, you know, the things that often people don't think about. We can also think about, you know, familial relationships and how they affect education. Like a lot of people, you know, a lot of educators, unfortunately, have this idea that the ideal college student is 18 years old, fresh out of high school, dedicates all their time to school, does not work, does not have a family. What does that do, you know, for the people who are quote unquote non-traditional? And how is that actually a non-traditional student? Like, what does a traditional student look like? I don't even understand, right? So we do that, and then I have them talk to each other in groups, and then they come up with as many identities, and sometimes there's some that I've never thought of, or that other people haven't thought of, and we just kind of list them all to say, yes, like everybody has identities, and if one person has to have it, the other people do. It just comes with the privilege of erasure. Now that said, one of the things that it's important is, and this is a question that I actually just fielded recently, was, you know, because I had my students come up with some of the readings for the class. Now these are not first years, these are 3307 students, so they're advanced writers. And they were picking readings from an intersectional perspective, and then they had to come up with questions to ask their classmates to lead the class discussion. And one of them was, if we are all intersectional, do we ever get to leave any of those identities behind? And how does that affect research? So we started talking about understanding how we can look at intersections as a framework for guiding research and asking the questions we need to be asking. And so I tend to really be a big proponent, and of course I didn't come up with this, right? Like I think like some of Freire's students, like Donaldo, I think is how you pronounce that, Machado, and you know, other people too. I think like Sylvia Winters actually talks about this too, right? What we call like the critique from below, right? So just thinking about how, okay, so if you're in a science classroom and you are working in research to try to, you know, find a way to cure a particular disease, who are we going to talk to? Are we going to talk to the people with the money to go and get all the best treatments? Or are we going to talk to the people who don't have that? And then we talk about why that's important, right? And the thing being that if you talk to the people with the least access, you take care of everybody else coming up. So in order to do that kind of critique, you always have to think intersectionally. You can't address every single identity that ever existed. You really have to make particular choices, but there has to be, you know, some depth. And so I try to develop lessons that get my students to start thinking that, right? Because I really am a big proponent that 75% of writing happens in the mind. Understanding how to structure things and why we're doing what we do, and then letting the heart kind of guide us from there. Of course, like I'm also a really big proponent of more like liberatory praxis. But yeah, I mean, I think even just teaching students from the get-go that if you don't approach research intersectionally, like who is it for? Like it's not for real people. That maybe it's for like 2% or the 1% or something, but it really doesn't do as much good. And all research needs to have real world impact and consequences in order for it to be meaningful. So those are some of the things that I do. I'm not sure if that really addresses the question. Yeah, like finding ways that work for you that get students to start thinking on that level is important. It makes you a better writer, and I think it makes you a better human being. I'm blank, you know.
Define intersectionality.
Oh, who was that?
Doesn't matter. I pulled it from the board.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, there's many different ways to approach this, right? And of course, like the most traditional is to think about, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw and her really important work. And I think it's really interesting because, you know, a lot of her work is coming out of legal studies. And so a lot of critical race theory also comes out of legal studies, right? And if we understand the law as a discourse, as rhetorics, then that's our purview, right? But I think intersectionality is often misused. And it's often abused, and I see that happening a lot lately. And so here's the deal. I know that Crenshaw has said that intersectionality is not only about race, right? Because then it leads to people of color having to be the people, especially women of color, having to constantly be the people who talk from that angle, but other people don't. But intersectionality is always contextual, and we have to always understand the dynamics of a particular, right? And nationalism as a embodied rhetoric, or should I say a rhetoric of embodiment that tries to keep people within their place or in their proper place. And so intersectionality is a way of approaching things. It can never be a checklist thing that says, oh great, I've done it, I analyzed intersectionally. So for example, and so one of the things I think it's very important to get students to understand, when we go to different places in the world, we cannot expect that their experiences are necessarily going to be ours. They're not necessarily the same from one block to the next, right? So we have to go by the things that our context really calls for. So lately, I've been seeing a lot of work on intersectionality that completely discounts race, that talks about the ways in which intersections can also happen. Now, here's the deal, right? If I am working, I used to teach in Oklahoma, and I had a lot of rural Oklahoma, like geographically rural students. If I am talking about a particular demographic, you know, there's still a racial component, right? Like especially if I'm looking at, say, white women between 21 and 27 living in rural Oklahoma who are affected by a lack of resources and prenatal care, right? I say what demographic I'm looking at, but I talk about the race too. It's not like intersections can just happen and we can ignore some, when race is the primary marker by which humanity, or should I say our humanness, is measured in this society, right? I think there's a danger of thinking that because certain people might be privileged in certain areas, that that's something that doesn't get addressed. If you're not talking about it, fine, but you got to say why you're not. It cannot just be presumed. And I think too often the scholarship does. And quite frankly, I'm offended, not only as a person, a multiply marginalized person of color, but also I think it's a usurpation of Black women's intellectual work that often gets stolen and doesn't necessarily get credit. That's what I think.
Hi, I'm Jose.
Hi.
So one of the questions on the board is, could you speak on the rhetorical language choices you made and what does it mean to move? I was curious because in that same article, you speak on the trend of using dense and hard to follow language.
Mm-hmm.
You also fall into this?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular reason?
Yeah, that's a good question. So here's the deal. I don't think I'm as bad as Judith Butler. I hope not. But there's a difference, I think, in resonance when we use the kind of language that we do. It goes back and forth, right? So I deliberately choose to use like those vignettes or like those case studies or whatever you want to call them, as well as the pictures and things like that, to speak to different audiences, right? So I kind of agree with Butler in certain ways, right? Because whenever we're talking about work that is embodied, whenever we're talking about communities, marginalized communities, and I have faced this, and people that I care deeply about in the field have faced this, you know, especially several years ago. The idea was that when you speak about certain theories and how harmful they may be, or that they're not helpful to a lot of us, the first thing that you're going to hear is, oh, you probably have never read it. Oh, like, you just didn't get it. You know, it happens all the time, right? Like, academics were petty. And that's fine, except that when the pettiness is like punching down, like that ceases to be petty and that's violence, right? So one of the things that I deliberately do in that piece is I was trying to kind of weave in and out and do different things for different audiences, so that the big dense language is for other people in the field who might say like, oh, you're just complaining because like you just couldn't hack it. And it's like, oh yeah? Oh yeah, I want to see if you've read some of these things that I've read and if you understand, because actually, like, I tend to think of myself more as a theorist than anything. I really like theory. You know, I like Desserteau and Bourdieu and those people, you know, but I think like a lot of the times people don't understand that theories look differently, right? So if you look at a lot of, say, like native, I'll say Northern Native, right? Indigenous theories of being, a lot of people deal with, you know, different types of theory, and then they show how these ideas are actually coming out through story and things like that, right? So I'm thinking people like Malia Powell. I don't know if she will publish this piece soon, but Gail McKay has this wonderful Indian version of the rhetorical triangle, right? And so from an Indian perspective, it basically shatters this idea that the rhetorical triangle is very simple and stuff like that. So we are seeing these things. We know that we've developed these things as everyday praxis in order to survive, but then you deploy them and people say like, oh, that's so simple. Yeah, you're just writing about your background. So there's always a need, right? And so I think about people in particular who do this kind of work. So for example, like Malia, like Jacqueline Jones Royster, who is talking about all these things, and you will never, ever for you to think that Jacqueline Jones Royster, hasn't read something, then you probably never met her, right? There's some like really great scholars who, for good or ill, have had to take on that language of the academy and push back with it to say, no, like, we're going to stop right here, right? And so in this piece, it was a very strategic choice as well. It really depends on who I'm writing for. A lot of the times when I'm writing for a more academic audience, which of course demographically doesn't necessarily reflect me, in terms of race or gender or disability or anything like that, I will do that because I want people to never forget who it is talking to them, right? Like I want people to understand that this was knowledge that was hard won, even though it was imposed, and I have taken it and I've done other things with it too. But then having those vignettes for students who might be from my community or some other communities, and if that's all they read and they just go, hey, you know what, I'm not the only one, other people have gone through this, I'm okay, it's what's happening around me that's not okay. If that's all they get out of that article, I think that's basically all I really care about. Besides, talking back to fellow egghead academics. I don't know if that makes any sense. I studied with C.Jan Swearingen, who was a feminist rhetorician who was always very supportive. And she always said, like, her big piece of advice was, you never talk over a community that you are talking about. If they cannot find entrance into something, then you're doing it wrong. Somebody who's smart doesn't need to use those big words to prove that they know what's going on. So in my case, I want to think of it as kind of like this trickster rhetoric where I'm using it on purpose to say, well, I know I don't have to use this language, but do you? Like that kind of thing. Culture really influences what I do.
Hi, my name is Ryan.
Hi.
Kind of one of the questions that it's also coming from the board, so I didn't make this question up. But from your intersectionality piece, you do mention that like being the representation and being the diversity in a space is exhausting. So how do you replenish yourself in terms of being that representation and being that diversity?
I'm still trying to figure that out. Yeah, I mean, it's exhausting for a lot of different reasons, not just with the teaching. A lot of the times when people are having issues or questions or problems with students because they can't, obviously there's a lack of cultural cultural knowledge and stuff like that. You're the person who gets asked, right? And then when you explain what's going on, people get mad. So that's exhausting. You're on every other committee, right? And that's exhausting. But you can't say no a lot of the times because you know who's going to end up bearing the brunt of bad practice, right? It's like your students. You also have to write from a lot of different positions. And it's great that people want to hear, but it's also exhausting. I have literally had, colleagues at my institution tell me, well, it's a lot easier for you to get published because, race is a sexy topic, race and racism. Also heard, I think talking about decolonization is great, but what does it have to do with first year writing? It's irrelevant. And I'm like, really? All right, I'll be sure to tell my ancestors that when I see them. you know, so it's constantly exhausting having to feel like trying to feel seen, trying to feel respected, trying to feel understood. But I think, you know, once in a while it's going to get to you, but I think like the more important thing is to realize that, again, like, who is your primary audience? It's like, you, whatever I do, if you're predisposed to think that way because you're mean, or they don't think they're ist, but they are, then I don't got to talk to you. You're not who I'm here for. You know, it's, you know, pardon me if this sounds sacrilegious, but it's one of those very like come to Jesus moments, right? It's like, all right, well, that's great. You're so holy. I'm not here for you, kind of thing. Social justice warrior, right? I think so. And so I think picking your battles is really important. I think understanding who you're talking to, who you're here for, who the work is for. And I think one of the big things that I had to learn in terms of self-care was realizing that we may never see the work that we're putting in right now, right? From an Indigenous perspective, you work for generations to come, 7 generations into the future. So I think sometimes to myself, 7 generations ago, what were my ancestors doing? I find ways of like trying to see things from those different perspectives that for me is very grounding. And I think that's self-care. I think centering one's work within not just a body mind, but that body mind spirit paradigm is very important. Because this, you know, like what feeds you, because this work can be very exhausting and also very traumatizing. There are projects that I put away for 2 years because I could not go back to it because it was just so bad, so violent. But I think it also is about understanding and channeling things. And I think sometimes people take me wrong. I do a lot of jokes. I like humor. I like painting. I like to take care of myself. Most of what I do, no matter what I do, is always geared towards hopefully, you know, building compassion and empathy in certain ways. But I'll be honest and say that I often live with a lot of anger. And so channeling that anger in a way that works is very useful to me. In the past, I have been in underground hardcore punk bands. So getting to yell really is helpful. Yes, I like Rage Against the Machine. And you know, when he says anger is a gift, right? And of course, he's not necessarily making that up. He's quoting people, you know, like MLK and Baldwin, right? I think it is, because sometimes we have to understand that those negative emotions that we live with don't have to eat at us. They can be fuel, right? And even understanding that we can like reframe certain things might actually help us, I think, in certain ways, take care of ourselves. But we also have to find time for ourselves and our families and the people we care about. I don't know how to shut that off. I think I wish I were better, but we have to, right? Because what's the point of spending ourselves and then we never actually pay attention to the people we're doing it for? So food's good. I like to bake, you know. And sometimes I just really like to listen to really loud music and you know, take long road trips and scream out the window like I'm Lady Gaga. All good. Yeah. And then there's my dog, and I hope he doesn't. So what is this board that people keep talking about? Because I'm like, it's on the board, and I feel like I'm about to do that. I don't know. People are too young, but I'm no whammy. No whammy. Stop. Nobody's ever seen that?
Yeah. Like that was just us, our conversation beforehand, where we all wrote out our questions. So if folks didn't feel comfortable asking a question, they could write it down and someone else could ask it.
Oh my God.
So
I love that idea.
Those are our questions, not like somebody random, like a conversation board.
Nice.
Great for anonymizing those too.
I got this question from Reddit.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Hannah, and I was forced to ask my question. Okay, they were supporting me to ask this question. So, how did you gain the interest in intersectionality? And then what led you to further research that topic? And how do I, like, as someone that is starting research, in a kind of a similar like field, getting the necessary tools to like further that research, because I'm interested in like LGBTQ like communities and like the intersectionality. I cannot say that word. Intersectionality of like that community and whatnot.
Okay, well, that's a great question. I mean, in the end, it's like I got interested in intersectionality because, you know, like, I mean, again, you know, we all live it, but as someone who is affected from, you know, through different axes of identity, for me, I knew that if I were to look at one thing or another, like it wouldn't be enough, right? And so I know that a lot of the times people, like, they'll start researching things like that, and it gets overwhelming because you want to do everything. But here's what I would recommend is that you start from one place, right? And you go into it looking at a particular, if you're looking at identity, right? So see, now I can't talk. LGBTQ identity, right? So you could start looking at the research, like if you're doing like queer rhetorics, it kind of talks about everything. It especially talks a lot about like, say, like trans or non-binary identities. And again, it's always a good thing to kind of start from those voices who might not get a lot of play in a particular discussion, right? So that even within the queer community, it might happen that non-binary people or trans people are kind of marginalized somewhat as well, right? Because, you know, of the kind of history that we've told, right? Which is interesting, right? Especially like during, I keep thinking about it, like during Pride Month, people celebrating, you know, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson, but somehow, like, you know, gay rights was somehow not looking at a lot of these issues. So, you know, you got to start somewhere, like, and you also can't, like, you know, get down on yourself because you don't know everything at once, right? Because you're not going to, I mean, you could be doing it for 20 years and still not know everything, right? So I think it's really about maybe what you're drawn to at a particular moment. So I started looking at gender first. My dissertation was actually about medieval women mystics and how they used the body, and medieval people were very, very weird in like the stuff that they said about bodies and gender and stuff like that. But, you know, obviously, depending on what you're looking at, a lot of it is not looking at things like race, right? It is there though, right? So a lot of my interest actually gets honed in the work on gender that intersects with, you know, anti-Semitic uses of women's rhetorics, right? And I knew that eventually I was going to want to apply this knowledge to my current situation. And I had to start then thinking, well, what are the things I'm going to look at? And so one thing leads to the other, leads to the other. So I go from that to understanding, right, that what's getting done during that time, right? Because you know, we think about the Middle Ages as an actual thing, like it existed, but, you know, it existed in Europe, not in other places, right? There was no middle. So then when colonization of the Americas, Gemanahuac, happens, what ends up happening is that they bring those processes, those ideas. So automatically then I start looking at it from the perspective of gender intersecting with race and colonization and colonialism and coloniality, right? And then from there, it intersects further with issues of LGBTQ oppression, right? Especially when we consider that, you know, in ancient, I don't want to call it ancient because I mean it's still there, but you know, in pre-colonial Mexico, right, or what Mexica people called Anahuac, there weren't just two genders, right? There were other gender roles that people could fit into, right, and find expression in. And you know, as in any other place, you know, depending on the time and place, the context, sometimes, you know, things were kind of iffy, but a lot of the times, and we see this across the Americas, these were people that were highly respected, right, and viewed as having special knowledge that a lot of us do not have. So they, you know, they could range from being holy to being, you know, like very like what we might call sages and things like that. And so it starts to kind of do this, right, like as you go, but it really is about like finding a trajectory and then letting the journey kind of show you like where those connections are, and then also making relations with people that are working in those other areas as well. And then you talk to each other, and then you start finding out more about what you want to know or what you need to know. I like to think about it again as, you know, people often take research as like there's a right or there's a wrong, there's a yes or no, but there's only angles, right? Like people like Zizek will call it parallax, but you know, even in pre-colonial thought, right? Like the Inlakech Alakin means you're my other me, right? So you're seeing me from a different angle and vice versa. And so we can't have a full story until we have all of those perspectives put together. So I think, yeah, like the best way to kind of approach this is see what really sticks out to you, find maybe more of a topic, and then from there, see how that particular topic affects different people within a particular community based on, you know, who they are. And I am a really big proponent of letting your heart kind of do its logic. I think, like, let your heart decide, like, who needs more of my attention in this moment, and seeing what comes of that.
So if you still have time, but if not, that's fine too. Now we have time for, if you had a question for us, it is 2 o'clock though.
I mean, if you got time, I got time. I like to talk.
All right.
I have been known to stay like 2 hours after class talking to students just because we want to chat.
Yeah.
I like that better than teaching. No, I didn't say that. Okay. So, well, first, like, does anybody else have any other questions? Hello.
I don't know for the camera, so I don't know for the
right here.
Oh, okay. My name is Laura, and I just want to say that I really like. Well, I don't write others, so I guess we all write. Never mind. So, but I not. Yeah. I really like when you talk about intersectionality and the position. Like I'm a geologist, so instead of thinking about writing, I thought about like about actually the physical position and the intersection, right? So I really like when you say that when you talk about this with your students, that you actually make them draw it. because then it's just easier to understand, right? Because physically and in our community, we have different positions and intersections, right? And if you start overlapping those, that just helps you to inform who you're at, and as you said, it just creates this like very cool start point. So I really like that idea, and I'm just going to steal it. So.
Thank you. I just want to say, like, also though, so speaking as a geologist, right? I think it's really important to understand the intersections also of disciplinarity, right? So a lot of the ideas that I have, because again, theorizing, right? At the center of rhetoric and communication is always that notion of kairos, right? It's the right time, place, and space, and it's determined by exigence, right? Like there's something that is compelling you to talk. But what does it mean to have an appropriate place and space for giving a message when so many different people will have a different impression of what space and place and time are, right? So I really like that she brought up the geology, right? So one of the things that I really like to read on the side is physics. And people are like, what?
Yes.
I was originally going to be pre-med, and then I was like, but I like talking to people, right? I like the room to think like beyond the box. What is the box, right? Why? Really understanding rhetoric as epistemic and the ways in which we can ever only know the world through our schema, right? And the ways in which we develop words for that. And so for me, understanding time and space, right, as different from temporality, and you know, temporality in all of its forms, including temporality being the notion of within a particular space, right? Like the Middle Ages only existed here. What was happening over here? And sometimes you tell people, it's like, well, the Middle Ages weren't global. And they're like, what? Because like the way that we tell stories, right? So I have a piece that I'm not sure when it's coming out, but it talks about, we tend to think about exigence and ethos and kairos and all that stuff very surface level. It's in the here and the now, but it seldom addresses the notion of chronos and the long histories that lead up to this moment when that particular moment occurs, right? So we see that, and again, you know, my research is always driven by who I am as a person and my history, especially like its impact on family. You know, as someone of Indigenous origin. And so the idea that somehow Kairos is now, when we're doing the speaking, or even when something has happened. Well, what happens when the thing that happened 500 years ago? And it's been leading up to this moment when I have the stage to, you know, like the room to talk about this. It occurs to me that, you know, that incident that happened with the boy in Washington, D.C., and the native elder, where he said, no, I'm just standing here. And he came up to me with the drum. And so he was the one that, you know, was being aggressive or whatever. And I mean, if you only take it as within that moment, you know, maybe I could buy that argument. But when you realize that the place and space of that has been existing for 500 years and doesn't just happen in front of the Lincoln Memorial, but across the Americas, suddenly that excuse cannot hold much weight for me, because I know the feelings that led up to that, the deep roots that lead up to that moment. But if you don't have those, it's easy for you to think that it's only about the now. And so I think it's really important for us to really look into how other disciplines can help us like explain how these concepts that we tend to use really traditionally might themselves be colonial constructs, or maybe they can be expanded, or we can play with them. Yeah, and what does that do, right? Like, I'm thinking, is it Sarah Sharma who talked about temporality as time bound up with labor worth, right? It's time and how you use it to create money for others. So understanding that separation between, you know, time as a constant in the physics sense and what we do with it, and understanding that, you know, the other disciplines can actually tell us a great deal about what we want to do with this world, you know, and even if we're not talking about rocks, we're talking about, because like the one thing I really want to ask is I want to see who's who, and I want to see what you all are up to.
We got time for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, I feel like it's weird. Look, you know me a little bit already. I'm Eduardo.
Yes.
I'm the English major. A lot of my work, specifically in my research, has to do with looking at undergraduate voices and narratives, looking at the way that undergraduate students are talked about but not always included in discussions, scholarship. That also intersects with ideas I have about specifically letter writing and how to incorporate letter writing into writing processes. Not as just this thing that's going to be forgotten once you get to an academic paper, but something that's carried on throughout that process. Yeah, that's me.
Cool. Very cool.
Do you want to have an idea of who we are individually or who we are as a writing center and the work that we're trying to progress here?
It's up to you, but I feel like the writing center is the people in it, right?
Yeah.
You're not getting away from like telling me who you are.
Now tell her who you are.
Okay, so my name is Jolina. I am a bio grad. I just graduated this last year, but my focus in life has been reproductive justice as it surrounds birth and Black bodies. And coming into the Writing Center has given me a lot of language to address some of the inequities that I see in my own outside career and profession. And you're right, that anger just kind of sits on me. Like I walked in today and Eduardo was like, hey, I'd like you to facilitate a discussion about this. I'm like, fuck you! I don't want to facilitate anything today. But I went and I had some food and I calmed down and had a little chocolate. And so then it's kind of like, we're all in the mix here together trying to make this work. So that's who I am.
Hi, I'm Jose. My full first name is Joseankin. I'm a visual media student with an emphasis in animation. And I feel like I'm still trying to find my way in the writing center, like trying to find exactly what I want to do, because I feel like everything interests me, so I don't want to do all of it at once. But me and Eduardo actually did we just presented at this Four Cs.
Oh yeah, you were there.
Oh, I don't remember anybody. I was like, no. Okay. I was like,
we were indeed there. Yeah.
Yeah. Where we geographically mapped using Google Earth attendees for the conference who presented at IWCA and NCPTW 2016 through 2018. And yeah, so that's
nice.
My research.
Yeah.
Really happy yours.
I'm trying to figure out, because I know Eduardo came to the meeting, right?
The meeting.
At the, what do you call it? The Latino Caucus meeting?
I wasn't there.
You weren't there?
No, I was probably at a different meeting. There was so many. a lot of the time at the C's, I was spent hiding in the Scholars for the Dream Lounge because of the shit I was experiencing.
Oh my God, I know, I know. It's just like for the first time, like I think it's not the biggest group we've ever had, but because of like the space, also it was like super crowded, and I'm like, I know that he was there. My mind made things up. I don't know.
I think during the Latino caucus, there were other like caucuses and meetings going around, and I think we went to the undergraduate caucus or meeting or panel during that time.
For something over the phone?
Wait, were you at the Scholars for the Dream presentations?
Yeah, I was there supporting Eduardo.
Okay, so then yeah, I probably like, we passed like this.
Maybe, yeah, I had shorter hair and a mustache. And
I'll go back and look at the pictures.
thank you.
Hi, I'm Keith. So I am majoring in psychology and deaf studies, and I've been working in writing center for about 2.5 years now. And a lot of the research I focus on in here is focusing on the intersection between writing center and disability studies. So it started because of my deaf studies major, and I looked into how to work with students that are deaf, and I looked into a lot of research by like Rebecca Day Babcock and what she did in that sense. And then I started to venture more into disabilities in general, and how that in our practices and how we work with students with disabilities, and how they're really being marginalized, even though we're trying not to, but we still are. So I'm looking into ways and how we can work on progressing into making our space and our practices more inclusive in that sense.
Nice. Yeah, there's like some really cool work coming out of that. I'm trying to think if Mary Lee Gillies has anything specifically on disability, but a lot of the times it's about inclusivity. Melissa Elston like speaks specifically on disability in the Writing Center, especially writing as like a disabled scholar. So that's really interesting. I never got to work in a writing center, so I'm always really fascinated by like the dynamics and yeah, like all of the hard work of like having to reassure people that it's okay. And then like, you know, as you gear them through things, you know, because I know that, for example, even as just a professor who's going to see them all semester, you know, you finally get them hopefully to trust you, but like building that trust when they don't really know you as well or they don't see you as often is really difficult work that I think often doesn't get credited. So yeah, that's awesome.
Hello, my name is Hugo. So I'm a math student, and I worked at the Writing Center for almost a year now. I started research that looks at our institution as a Hispanic Serving Institute. So I'm curious in looking at the perspective of students and getting their perception about what that work or what the work the school is doing, what that looks like in terms of helping Hispanic students. But I'm also interested in like straying from the normal standard American English, and straying away from that in terms of like creating like graphic novels, and I'm co-writing a play with Jolino, so that's another thing.
Nice.
And
nice.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah, I love that. That's the other thing too, is I've been trying to get away from what we call, right, like the really standard genres of writing, because those are really exclusive as well. So if you read someone like Thomas King, I believe it's The Truth About Stories. He also has The Inconvenient Indian. He has a really great ethos. And he talks about really interesting things, but he frames it in terms of stories, like as a storyteller, right? But it's also theorizing, because obviously in a lot of indigenous cultures, that is how learning happens, through stories. And so if we think about like the ways in which the great playwrights and the great novelists have a way of teaching us things that like, you don't need to have all the theory, like you get to see it happen. Also, I think I'm a really great, I'm a big fan of comics, you know, as a way of communicating. Graphic novels, I love that. I've taught my classes before in looking at word and image using graphic novels. And the students really like it, and they realize it's interesting because a lot of them have never read a graphic novel and they don't realize just how much work it is to analyze them and or to create them, because we create them too. Shameless plug, the last issue of the Journal of Multimodal Rhetorics was about comics. There he is. Hey, stop. Enough. Enough. His name is Cilantro. He's kind of spicy. And also I'm Mexican. What am I going to call him? Chauncey? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. This is me in real life, okay? Is my credibility shot? Is that it now? Are we done? Like, weirdo. Okay. But yeah, I love graphic novels and I enjoy them, and I really am a big proponent of, I would love to see more textbooks written as graphic novels, like Jonathan Alexander's book on rhetoric, and like that's great. But let's hear from some like sassier people too. You know, I want to see some opinionated views on rhetoric. I'd really like that. Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Kate. I feel like I'm obligated to go next after everything you've said, because a majority of what I've been doing in like regards to like my research is very much around what is that?
There we go.
Very centered around like the incorporation of like memes into the academic universe, and the incorporation of like visual media and visual like representation to help students utilize visuals, as opposed to like reading things that's just purely words for like visual learners, I guess, because I'm a learner and I don't like reading long paragraphs. I just want like a visual representation of something that tells me what to do. And yeah, I'm a psychology major here at Nevada State, and I've created a now ongoing joke in the Writing Center about yeehaws and memes, and it's a good time.
Nice. There's like a, what do you call it? There's some stuff going on because like computers and writing is happening right now at Michigan State. And one of the things that people were doing was creating memes. And like, I know that they had like one thing of like political memes and I forget what else. And it's really interesting because, I mean, it's enjoyable. And memes do a lot of really hard and heavy lifting. And yeah, I think like what's really interesting is people don't see it as like proper rhetoric, but we've been visual societies before. And I think with the advent of digital technology, we're kind of starting to move like towards that again. I don't like to talk about it in terms of regression, the way that some critics might see it. I think it is, well, I don't also want to say evolution. I don't want to say that one thing is better than another. As you mentioned, different people learn differently. They communicate differently. But I do like the idea of what does it mean to make room for different modes of communication, like the way that people in a global society might speak different languages with each other, right? Like, what would that look like if we understood these as languages? And yes, I might write to you in an essay, but you respond in a meme or in pictures or something like that, or a graphic novel. And understanding that these texts can do the very same thing, right? Except I think we fetishized, you know, essay writing for a really long time. As Adam Banks said, it's time to kill that 5-paragraph essay. Or no, what did he say? Retire it as a essay emeritus or something like that. I thought that was great. So yeah, I love that. It's everybody's doing such great work. I feel boring now. Awesome. Come on, talk to me.
Come on, Hannah, you want to come up here now?
My plan is that soon everyone will be sitting by the computer.
So, I'm Hannah. I'm a criminal justice major, minoring in counseling. My research is in LGBTQ communities, and I don't know where to go with it yet. But I'm just reading all the things. But yeah, I didn't do anything cool like a comic, but that's but that's me.
I love that though. I mean, I love that when you're like reading everything